Around the table, as Leon said, we have a group of community leaders, activists, people who are who care very deeply about our community and care about our community not only here in America, but care about Israel, the safety and security of Israel, care about national security here in America, which ties into the safety and security of Israel, as our candidate George Phillips will explain more. He knows better than all of us. I first came to George, actually George first came to us on the recommendation of Chairman Ed Cox. Ed Cox, many of you know, is the son-in-law of Richard Nixon. He is the chairman of the Republican Party. And Chairman Cox had urged several of the candidates of his party to reach out to the Orthodox community, Tom Reed, others are running for Senate, others are running for Congress, others are running for other positions. And our paths crossed several months ago at an Agudath Israel function where George came and spent some time at the dinner. Looking a little bit into his platform and looking more into the platform and stances and positions of his opponent, Maurice Hinchey is no stranger to anybody who cares about Israel in America. Maurice Hinchey is a left-leaning congressman who has consistently voted against every resolution and every bill except for foreign aid, because he's very good on foreign aid, and that's where he rests his hat on, when it comes to the safety and security of Israel. When Israel was under attack this past year, during the flotilla incident, and even prior to the flotilla incident, during the Ramat Shlomo incident, Israel was isolated throughout the world. And Congress, both sides of the aisle, issued resolutions and statements. The Pope Peter's letter, the Cantor Hoyer letter, where hundreds and hundreds of members from both sides of the aisle signed on, affirming, reaffirming the relationship between America and Israel. Maurice Hinchey did not sign that letter. When there was a resolution to discredit and to discount the Goldstone report, hundreds of members signed that letter. Maurice Hinchey did not sign that letter. But Maurice Hinchey did sign a letter. When there was a letter written by the Gaza 54, as they have come to be known, 53. Well, now it's the Gaza 53, urging President Obama to open up, to pressure Israel to open up the border between Israel and Gaza, well before the flotilla incident. 54 congressmen and women signed that letter. One retracted, and she gets credit for heroically retracting, and Maurice Hinchey was one of those 54. You can count on Maurice Hinchey to sign onto every left-leaning, ridiculous, outlandish resolution, but you cannot count on Maurice Hinchey to do the right thing. He doesn't support sanctions against Iran, and if he does now, it's only because of pressure. He does not support issues related to Israel's national security. And we've had enough. And we've had enough of every congressman and woman who says one thing and does something else. Sure, you get up in a speech and say, I love Israel, I support Israel, I'm for the community, I'm for national security. It polls well, but actions speak a lot louder than words. And in Congress, there is a record, and Maurice Hinchey's record is there for anybody who wants to see it. And so George Phillips has been challenging Maurice Hinchey on his Iran record, on his Israel record, on his national security record, on his business record, on his investment record, on his wasteful spending record. All of these records are being challenged. And on family values, national security, immigration, and every issue, frankly, that this country holds dear and our community holds dear, Maurice Hinchey is wrong and George Phillips is right. And therefore, though we don't specifically necessarily live every day in the district of George Phillips, our community has heavy investment in Sullivan and Ulster counties. Heavy. We care what happens in Sullivan County. We care what happens in Ulster County. We own properties, we own businesses, we have camps, our children summer there, our families vacation there. We have a presence in those counties. And if we have a presence and vote and pay taxes in those counties, then we have an obligation and a right, and frankly, a moral mandate to make sure that the candidates who run and are elected in those districts hear what we have to say and represent what we have to say. Maurice Hinchey does not do any of that. It is my honor and privilege to introduce and to endorse personally, and I hope that others in this room will agree and share that sentiment with me, George Phillips for the 22nd District of District upstate, Congressional District, to represent the interests and the issues of our community, as well as the larger community, thank you, Leon, in Congress. And it's an uphill battle. Right now it's an uphill battle, and he needs help. And those candidates who are like-minded with us, be it Republican or Democrat, we do not vote partisan. We vote issues. We vote candidates. Those candidates that will speak to our issues will get our support. It's my honor to introduce George Phillips.
Thank you. Well, thanks so much for having me here today, and I'm just overwhelmed, first going around the table and hearing all the things that you're doing for the community here in Brooklyn and in Sullivan County, and this is a very important election. We've got not just the economic issues, but the survival of Israel and international security on the line in this election here and for our country. But I think just going around the table and being here with you is a reminder that ultimately the most important thing is faith and family, and it's just amazing seeing this emanate out of the room here, hearing that the community is growing, being a school teacher, seeing a time when values in America are falling apart, and to hear that your community is growing, and to know that I think there is, for this success and this care and concern and all the humanitarian projects you do, deep-seated spirituality. I think it starts with love for God, the commandments that we're rooted in our heritage. And so I'm very impressed by that. I'm deeply thankful for Michael's words here. And my experience with the community actually began working for Christopher Smith from New Jersey. He represents Lakewood, New Jersey. He had told me that it was the largest yeshiva in the country. And we saw some wonderful leaders coming in our office. Smith, who some of you might know, actually headed up the Helsinki Commission. And when he was elected to Congress in the early 80s, his first trip was for on behalf of Soviet Jewry who are being persecuted. He worked heavily on refugee issues. He continues to be very passionate to this day about human rights issues, and we know how bad it was in the 80s especially. I was amazed seeing some rabbis from the community in Lakewood, the projects they were sponsoring overseas. We had some leaders come in and say, we're funding a school in Kazakhstan, and the Muslim government says, okay, you can have the section of the school for the Jewish students to study and learn and practice their faith, and they're putting tremendous resources in, but depending on who won the local elections and what the government was doing, they would suffer tremendous trouble, and Smith would play interference and try to help out. Smith led 2 global anti-Semitism conferences to Europe, and we know that anti-Semitism is on the rise. Again, we know the UN is, in my opinion, the biggest vehicle for that.
Human Rights Commission.
Yeah, one, the Human Rights Commission with all the human rights abusers in it, and a lot of these Islamic fundamentalist nations that are on the commission, Libya, Sudan, Iran was on the commission as well. So just a disgrace when he fought those battles. I was in the office, he worked foreign affairs everywhere, but I was in the office when he just stood up to allies. We were talking with leading figures from Uganda. What else can we work on? He was very happy with some of their AIDS projects and other things. And he said, why do you keep voting against Israel at the UN? What we do, we didn't know that was important to you. It has just become the trendy thing, and we see this coming from the United Nations. My work specifically in Congress was actually on UNRWA reform, and I think reform is a light word. What's going on in some of those camps is nothing less than disgusting. Our research showed, and this was 5 or 6 years ago, teachers putting up posters glorifying suicide bombers, anti-Semitic teachings in the textbooks, in hundreds of millions of dollars.
That we're paying for.
Yes, and I have to tell you, I didn't have security clearance at that point. We had the State Department running down, oh no, Mr. Smith is trying to defund UNRWA in the United Nations, and they were very anxious, very apologetic. we can have no apology that's simply unexcusable for promoting terrorism. I did have to leave the room at one point because there was some classified information, and the State Department was full of apologetics who were trying to kill this amendment. The bill ended up dying in the Senate for other reasons, but it was just totally unacceptable. So those were some of my experiences, and one other day that I'll never forget is being before the International Relations Committee, and this is going back 7 or 8 years, and an analyst talking, and he said, make no mistake, the critical issue in the world right now is Iran trying to get nuclear weapons. There should be somebody working at the White House at a very high level who all they do is think about Iran, and that they're talking to the president on a daily basis. And that was 7 or 8 years ago, and look at how we've dabbled from here.
This week he's in Syria, right? I thought it was
Yeah.
Lebanon, sorry, Lebanon.
Yeah, so that was my background with Smith. You look at Hinchey, and Michael highlighted some of his voting records from the Goldstone report. To say that Israel is intentionally killing civilians and to not take a strong stand against it, it is just unfathomable. The Iran issue, I think, is really paramount. Time and time again, he's been one of the only members of Congress to vote against sanctions on Iran. And when we say Iran, I think it's important to say Iran, state sponsor of terrorism. And we know that even without the nuclear threat, Iran for years has used surrogates, Hamas and Hezbollah, to murder innocent civilians in Israel. They've used surrogates to murder U.S. soldiers in Iraq. So the nuclear issue aside, they are an enemy, they are a terrorist state, and they should be confronted duly. The nuclear situation obviously is of paramount concern. I can't understand Maurice Hinchey's voting. I'm a Republican who is conservative, I believe, because of the times. Washington is a mess right now. Albany's a mess. We have the 3 wealthiest counties in the country right now in the Washington, D.C. suburbs. That means it's our money from New York State, from Brooklyn, from Sullivan County, from Binghamton, going down to feed a government that's just grown out of control down there right now. I think the solution is cutting waste in Washington, not programs that we're dependent on, Social Security, Medicare, and others, but just this waste. There's so much waste in Washington.
Would you consider food stamps waste?
I think we do have to have a safety net for the neediest, but there needs to be continued pushes on welfare reform and trying to do welfare to work programs. But the challenge, I think, in Sullivan County and others is where do we go to work right now? The economy's in such bad shape. I do believe that tax relief for business is critical. If you look at the district I am hoping to represent from Binghamton over to the Hudson Valley, this was an IBM haven years ago. IBM, I believe, made some poor decisions, but was also taxed out of the state, a very high corporate tax rate. They went to Ireland with a 12% tax rate. That type of math hits all of our businesses, our small businesses as well. And in a given year, 80% of jobs in the national economy are going to be created by small business. No, I believe we need tough environmental standards. We should close that loophole on the Clean Water Act. We should protect the drinking water, absolutely. Maurice Hinchey has a bill called the FRAC Act, and he says all we want to do is close this loophole, all we want to do is guarantee clean water. The bill would also bring in the EPA, federal regulators, federal inspectors. I don't think they're necessary. I think we can get it right on the New York State level. And so I think Hinchey's bill is really just a stall tactic to try to run out the clock, to try to delay this. The EPA would just delay the process, and I don't think we improve the environmental standards. It has gone on in 25 states. I'm not saying there haven't been problems. We've got to learn from what's going on in Pennsylvania. We've got to try to improve. We've got to hold those companies accountable. But I do believe we can and should move forward. And I know it's very sensitive in Sullivan County because this is one of the most beautiful places in New York State in the country. Support vouchers. I know in New York State right now it said, oh, they're not going anywhere. Let's look at tax credits would be something else that we've been looking at. And I actually was up lobbying in Albany with my school. Senator Libous from Binghamton is one of the top leaders in the Senate. We had
You work with the Catholic League.
Absolutely, yeah.
On this. In New York State, we're 27% of the non-public school population.
Yeah. And again, you look at what is, if your students were in, you're saving the public schools money because they're still getting the tax revenue, yet you're educating the students there, so it's saving them. And